Thank you so much for having me today. It's tough to follow both Susan's rethinking of two American classics that I've long enjoyed and now see in a very different light, and John's very moving account of the party program, which I think should be an inspiration to all of us. I'm going to do something a little different, which is, though, very much in the reasonably hallowed tradition of my profession as a historian. And I'm going to begin with a very small story of someone who has been more or less entirely forgotten, but whose story I think bears recovering and retelling here. Emanuel Weiss was a physician and a botanist. He was born in Austria at the turn of the 19th century. And Weiss had traveled the entire world in his capacity as a sailor. But by the summer of 1849, he had arrived in the United States ready to hatch a plan. In his travels to China, Weiss had seen the ravages of opium addiction, like we see in this very familiar genre, this picture of the opium den from the 19th century. And as a physician, Weiss was disturbed. But as an opportunist, Weiss also wondered why Americans, as enterprising as they were, didn't seize the opportunity to make some money. And it was true, Weiss knew, that the best opium in the world was grown in Turkey, in a very specific region in the highlands in the Aegean town of Afyonkarahisar, from which we get the name opium. And the addicted men and women of China were making use of the second best crop grown in Benares and Bihar in India, and that's a story we know well from the Opium Wars. And there was some reasonably okay opium grown in Upper Egypt as well. But Emanuel Weiss had read in the botanical literature of farmers who had grown good poppy crops in England, Germany, even Pennsylvania. So he wondered, what was preventing American farmers from outstripping Asian production and making good money, probably at the expense of Britain? Now, Weiss floated the idea in technical journals for the better part of a decade. No one was interested in the plan. But things began to change in the years after the American Civil War. For one thing, Americans, of course, had lost their lucrative cotton exports, and the balance of trade with Britain was falling. But maybe more importantly, there were new innovative markets for opium at home. Addicts still smoked the product in China, as well as in Chinatowns up and down the West Coast. But now white Americans were just as hungry for opium. Soldiers returning from the Civil War had come back with the promise of morphine to dull battle scars. And the invention of the hypodermic needle in 1853 gave them a new and efficient way to take it. But most importantly for Weiss, there were new spaces for cultivation in the great American West. At the end of the war, the botanist traveled to the new territory of Arizona. The land reminded him instantly of the fields in Turkey and India, where peasants scored poppies for their tacky gum. And his plan slowly came together. If the government would grant him a large land concession, he would ask Greek peasants from Smyrna to bring their opium cultivation expertise to the United States. Newly freed blacks from the American South would come too, making Arizona the new opium capital of the world. Of course, Arizona would sell directly to addicts, but also to the pharmaceutical companies who were now turning raw opium into morphine and other medicines. Now, I bring up Emanuel Weiss's plan not only because historians are professionally obligated to dredge up every kind of failed scheme from the past, but I think the world he lived in was not entirely dissimilar from our own. Weiss saw Americans who had many different uses for a substance, pharmaceutical, recreational, otherwise, and he was puzzled by the scheme of imports and exports that moved them broadly from Asian fields into American ports and then into American bodies. And he wondered, in his writing, if it wouldn't simply make more sense to just produce this dangerous but useful set of drugs at home. This wasn't an entirely new question. Weiss wasn't the first to ask it. It had come up the very first time that Europeans had encountered opium. The Portuguese explorer Alfonso de Albuquerque had asked a similar question in 1513 after meeting Indians who drank opium water from vessels like the ones you see on the right. And he requested Don Manuel to authorize the import of a man who knows how to work opium, and for the best poppies from the Azores to be grown for opium across Portugal. This was a question that percolated in the background But it grew more urgent in the 1860s and the 1870s as Americans grew increasingly concerned with questions of safety, purity, and distance. New technologies like aluminum cans, steamships, refrigerated rail cars were all bringing useful products of uncertain origin into American pantries and their medicine chests. And Americans were now confronting new anxieties about what relationship these products bore to their place of origin. These are the same years in which Americans were first beginning to grow addicted to opiates in great numbers, even if medical specialists in that era preferred terms like opiocapnism, opiophagism, morphinism, even heroinism. And Weiss's era was an era when the new questions of use, abuse, and addiction were dovetailing with larger concerns about markets, trade, and how the worlds of production and consumption were interlinked in complex but important ways. And this insight, I think, is worth recovering in a year when more Americans have died already from opioids than HIV, car crashes, or gun deaths. Now, if there's anything that historians do particularly well, it's to call attention to moments when standard narratives either contradict one another or they just don't fit with the best evidence at hand. And journalists who've written on the crisis have appeared to settle on two both incorrect and contradictory narratives in their accounts of the epidemic and its origins. And the first, and we've hinted at this throughout this afternoon's session, zeroes in on the physicians and the pharmaceutical companies who midwifed the rise of opioid abuse in the United States. And the journalist Brian Goldstone, he summarizes these narratives very succinctly. He says, pressured, manipulated, otherwise bought off by the pharmaceutical industry, medical providers got millions of patients hooked on pain pills. These patients soon craved the high of cheaper and deadlier drugs such as heroin. The second narrative links opioid fatalities to broader crises of poverty, deindustrialization, and inequality, casting these as correlates or preconditions for opioid addiction. And deaths like these are what the Princeton economists Ann Case and Angus Deaton, who Susan mentioned, have described as deaths of despair, and I think we both use that material, but we read it differently. These accounts, this death of despair account, I think is racially tinged. It links opioids to a rising white male mortality rate in the United States. Now, the problem with both of these accounts is that neither really holds up under great scrutiny, and even less so when they're read together. The prescription of opioids in the United States did skyrocket over the last 3 decades, but in 2010, high-dose prescriptions began to taper off, and overdose deaths from non-prescription drugs like heroin, fentanyl, and carfentanil began to rise dramatically. In other words, it had begun perhaps with pharmaceutical companies, but the crisis endured even as they tapered off. And these deaths also came at a time when the United States was beginning to recover from the Great Recession. It might be tempting to blame, of course, rising inequality, but another team of economists at Princeton for an NBER working paper demonstrated convincingly that there's no simple causal relationship between economic conditions and the abuse of opioids. So if fools rush in where angels fear to tread, historians can always do that for economists. Historians of addiction, of drugs, have told us a great deal about the long story of opioid addiction in the late 19th and 20th century, the rise of new international regulatory regimes, the relationships between the American government and pharmaceutical companies. Through Samuel Roberts' work, we're learning, and I think we'll learn quite a bit more about the rise of therapeutic communities, maintenance treatment, harm reduction approaches. Anthropologists working in a similar vein have taught us a great deal about the social worlds of addiction and use. But I think what we lack and what I'm trying to provide is an understanding of where these substances actually come from. And in other words, that's a political economy of opioids in the 20th century that unpacks the world of trade, markets, law, medicine, that's just as complicated as that which Emanuel Weiss surveyed 150 years back. That's the work that I've been taking on. I've been doing that in archives in India and Turkey, Australia, Europe, and the United States. And this is the broad contour of the stories that those archives begin to tell. The story, of course, begins with the plant. Until the advent of synthetic opioids, pharmaceutical manufacturers relied upon a requisite but unstable supply of alkaloids, all derived from poppies. And peasants around the world followed a very similar process to extract opium gum from capsules, lancing poppies in the field over days and weeks, and collecting the resin which accrued. For manufacturers, the biggest concern was always labor. The holy grail of production was the promise of extraction without the need to score poppies. That was a project that would have vastly reduced the reliance on labor from Asia. A Hungarian chemist developed a workable process for extracting morphine from poppy straw in the 1920s, but his method wouldn't become economically viable until about 50 years later. So, in the interim, Turkish and Indian poppy cultivation, laborious, risky, and confined to a small number of districts in central Anatolia and north and central India, powered the global production of licit and illicit opioids throughout the first 3/4 of the 20th century. Pharmaceutical manufacturers deemed the Indian product inferior to the Turkish supply on account of its putatively lower alkaloid content, reserving it instead for the Chinese market. But when the two world wars underscored the fragility of the Turkish sources, Indian opium suddenly gained a new allure. And its role grew more and more prominent after the nation's independence. And in 1953, India's entry into the United Nations Opium Protocol offered the country most favored status for the supply of raw opium. 15 years after that, Richard Nixon's effort to stamp out Turkish heroin production resulted in a very brief but determinative global shortage of basic medicines. For a moment, the American Medical Association wondered whether or not American patients would even have access to codeine-based cough syrups. And in an effort to stave off future shortages, the United States in 1981 mandated that 80% of its pharmaceutical imports come from so-called traditional producers, and there were really only two of them, India and Turkey. That timing, 1980, 1981, wasn't entirely a coincidence. The early 1980s, it's also the restive moment where we can begin to discern the earliest contours of the modern American crisis. Against the backdrop of deindustrialization, pain was emerging as a new metric for care, described as the fifth vital sign that medical practitioners were asked to monitor. For the first time, these familiar cards were printed showing a series of 10 increasingly, I guess there's how many are here? There's 6 here. Increasingly agonized cartoon faces by which patients were asked to measure their own levels of pain. And opioids suddenly had a new place of pride in the treatment of pain after the 1980 publication of a short letter in the New England Journal of Medicine that practitioners and pharmaceutical representatives broadly misread as suggesting that opioids were safe for home use. That story is well known and has been reanimated and retold again and again by journalists. But the supply side of the opioid crisis remains essentially untold. By the 1980s, Americans were consuming a growing share of the world's Indian and Turkish opium. But Turkish producers were moving towards the direct manufacture of alkaloids from concentrate of poppy straw, a method that didn't require quite as much manual labor. Indian producers grimaced at those changes, but both Indian and Turkish producers found common cause in resisting the encroach of the new Tasmanian poppy industry. Australians had raised experimental crops in the 1960s, but by the 1980s, they were fast emerging as a formidable competitor to the traditional producers with the lawyers to match. And the most precipitous changes were yet to come. As lawsuits and trade battles roared in Washington, the question would soon emerge as to how important poppy was to be in the management of American pain, if it remained important at all. Semi-synthetic opioids, and these are compounds derived from opium alkaloids like thebaine, had been available to druggists since the synthesis of heroin in 1874. A slew of semi-synthetic opioids like oxycodone, hydrocodone were synthesized by German chemists over the following decades. And while morphine and codeine still remained essential to the American apothecary, these semi-synthetic compounds had grown in importance throughout the 20th century, with an increasing percentage of the global morphine supply being used to produce them. By the 1930s, new fully synthetic compounds like pethidine had been developed, which activated the same molecular receptors as poppy-based opioids. It took a while for lab-manufactured drugs like methadone and buprenorphine to gain acceptance for use in opioid replacement therapy. But it was fully synthetic drugs like fentanyl and carfentanil, alongside drugs like heroin, that Americans turned to in the second half of the 2010s. And India and Turkey play a little role in the last wave of this crisis, where producers in China have picked up the slack, smuggling minute quantities in cat food packaging, for instance, with lethal consequences. So this historical approach doesn't substitute for the harm reduction strategies, the sensible policing approaches, the medication-assisted treatment that might be at the center of any good plan to meet the crisis head-on. But as a historian, I think that an effort to unpack the intertwined history of supply and demand offers us new insights into the origins of the crisis, and it hints at certain ways forward. Writing a transnational history of the opioid crisis means looking for clues in very unexpected places. And one such place is here on the left. It's a small private archive in Sithamau town. It's a dusty, basically, village in central India where the paper of Indian opium merchants are gathering dust. The world of opium looks exceedingly different from this dry stretch of the Malwa Plateau. Traders wonder what new regulation in faraway places like Vienna or Washington mean for their business. The incipient opioid crisis looks different as well from the Ankara offices of the TMO on the right. It's the Soil Products Agency of the Turkish government, which regulates the cultivation and export of poppies from Anatolia. So in this story, we find that relatively small decisions and conflicts have outsized and unexpected impact. A good year in a single Indian district might lead to an unexpected glut in American supply. And likewise, in years when demand tapers from the United States, you see a glut in India. So surging demand for fentanyl in Mississippi leads to the building of a clandestine laboratory in China's Wuhan province. And each of these are small pieces in a larger global opioid system where demand, supply, and labor are connected in complex and intricate ways. When I describe this work to other historians, they often suggest that there's a very direct parallel between the global world of opioids, between that and the political and economic life of sugar over the last several centuries, both commodities that remade bodies, economies, medicine, and trade. And I think that there's a lot of truth to that comparison, as well as some important limitations. But I'll leave us here with the thought that the world of opioids and their supply remains no less opaque to us than it did to Emanuel Weiss, writing 150 years ago. And I think Weiss's questions dovetail with our own over more than a century and a half's distance. Does this particular arrangement need to be this way? Might something different have emerged from the ashes of the imperial opium regime? And was there or is there some kind of arrangement that would have brought pain medicine to those who needed it while obviating the American carnage which has characterized the first decades of this century? These are the markets of pain whose complexity requires this historical work and whose recovery, I think, might help point the way forward. So I think I'll stop there, and I think we'll take about a 10-minute break before concluding the panel.